Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. I'm Robby Jones, and I'm the host for this episode. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Jemar Tisby.
Hey, folks.
And Kristin Du Mez.
Hey, great to be here again.
So every episode, one of us takes a topic from the news or from things we've experienced this week and presents it to the group for discussion. We call the show Unscripted because we don't entirely know where the conversation's going or exactly where it's going to come out. So this episode of the Convocation Unscripted, I will now declare in session. So it's Democratic National Convention week. We're going to start there. And we're going to start with you, Kristin, because you've been on the ground. So bring us up to speed. What have you seen? What's been happening?
Yes, I just got back home, although already a bit of FOMO. I'm very curious what's going to be going down tonight. And so as soon as we get off this call, I'm going to be tuning in again. It was my first convention of either party, and it was much more interesting than I thought it would be. I'll start with that. Obviously some self-selection on my part because I tend to move in the religion and politics circles and progressive faith circles. And so, word on the street is that Democrats don't do faith outreach, that they, you can't be religious or Christian and a Democrat. In some spaces, you're going to hear that. In others, you will not. But and that was absolutely not the case. So, on the ground, every session I went to, nearly every address I heard, people were not just talking about faith, but really, fluent in talking about different faith traditions and their personal faith commitments and how that shaped their politics. I was in the audience for a panel moderated by a good friend, Catherine Stewart, for example. Representative Jamie Raskin was on that panel and incredibly eloquent about how his faith shapes his politics and how Christians and people of all faith should feel absolutely welcome to bring their faith into their politics, even while upholding, and especially while upholding, the separation of church and state. Right. So separation of church and state is about not privileging one religious view or one religious group over all of the others. It is not about prohibiting people to act out of their faith commitments. And so it was just a very eloquent and common sense rendition that, when I posted this on social media, I saw a lot of people saying, it's as simple as that, isn't it? Right? Like, how do we get into this Christian nationalist, Christian right kind of conundrum where over and over again, they're really weaponizing this, faith and politics and saying that the other side, the Democrats, are anti-Christian, that they will not allow you to bring your faith into your politics, that they hate Christians and all of that, when in fact, no, it's just welcome. Bring your faith on equal terms. People of all faiths and people of no particular faith, we are all in this together and we are working for the common good. So bring your resources by all means. Use your powers of persuasion, but not coercion. And let's do this together. I would say even broader than the conversations around faith too, such positivity across the board at all of the sessions I attended at the DNC. There was great sense of humor, great spirit, positivity, love. If you were watching last night, you saw the emotional tribute Tim Wells's son, Gus, right? I love you, Dad. That's my dad, right? This is kind of beautiful, just heartfelt, genuine family values, if you will. Real authenticity. I was at the Obamas that evening where they were speaking, and I wrote about that on my Substack. Two incredibly powerful addresses. Kind of took the gloves off, especially Michelle Obama. A little bit fun, she's, when they go low, we go high. Well, she went a little less high, but what was really interesting, and I wrote about this too, is that both of them weren't just playing to the crowd. They were speaking to their side. eloquently Barack Obama calling Democrats, calling his own side in to say, hey, in this political engagement, we need humility. We need to be aware of our own prejudices, of our own shortcomings, right? And when we see those prejudices and shortcomings in others and on the other side, right, we engage with some compassion. We engage with some humility, with some understanding. And so over and over again, I saw attempts to depolarize, to kind of find a new foundation for our politics, to bring your convictions, to bring the fight, yes, but to do so respecting the dignity of all Americans, including your opponents, and really trying to reframe the conversation and recenter our the way we do politics. All of that I found very refreshing. I'll say I also stopped by the Evangelicals for Harris booth. And I think I'd love Jemar to just fill us in on what Evangelicals for Harris has been up to. You're one of the Evangelicals for Harris. And how do you see that organization or movement, or at least Zoom call, playing into some of these issues of religious, cultural, political polarization?
Well, I'm thrilled that you got to go there in person, Kristin, and bring back dispatches from the DNC. The whole time that the DNC has been going on, I've been thinking about the reaction to Evangelicals for Harris. And this wasn't a surprise that people on the right absolutely relentlessly, brutally attacked any Christian on this call. And by the way, I should say the invitation was to evangelicals or evangelical adjacent folks. So a lot of folks have commented, Jemar, do you call yourself an evangelical? No, I don't. Typically, I refer to myself as a Black Christian, but I do know evangelicals. I've been in these spaces, and so therefore, I felt a sort of responsibility even to have a conversation on this call. So that call was in line with what's been happening since Biden stepped aside and Kamala got the endorsement. All of these different demographic groups coming along, having these online Zoom calls in support, right? And as soon as it was announced, and I think it's just that word, evangelicals, because there was a Christians for Harris call, I think the day before. And that certainly got some pushback and flack, but nothing like that I saw online anyway. Evangelicals for Harris. Kristin, you brought into the conversation in-group moderates, and I think at least that idea of, if you use that term evangelical, you're part of the in-group of a particular kind of Christian who, at least for the past 40 years, if not more, has had this almost inseparable allegiance between evangelicalism and Republican politics. So therefore, you can't even be an evangelical for Harris. It's a contradiction in terms, is what they would have us believe. And so you mentioned it before, like folks who say, well, you can't be Christian and vote, not just Democratic. The epithets they use are baby killers, genital mutilators for children because of transgender stuff. All of these caricatures of the Democratic Party platform and more liberal policy stances. They want, obviously Democrats want immigrants who are criminals to invade, all of this stuff. So the event itself, I think, was a lot like what you described the DNC, in the sense that you had a lot of people speaking very intelligently and eloquently about how their faith shaped their values and why it led them to support this particular candidate. And this is a critical aspect of our political landscape. For a lot of Christians, and I'll say white Christians in particular, they've had generations of discipleship that said abortion was the number one issue. The only truly Christian vote was a Republican vote. And anyone who goes against that and calls themselves Christian is either deeply misguided or not a Christian at all. And here's the crux of it for me. this isn't just the far right. This is more moderate, if you will, evangelical Christians are also deeply struggling with this. And this is just my theory. This is just me being around a lot of these folks for a long time. Typically, elections for this demographic are principled, almost philosophical decisions. The outcome of a particular election would affect life sort of on the margins, but it didn't feel existential to a lot of people. Now, there are always exceptions, and I'm not minimizing those. But I think for the first time, you get a lot of white evangelicals realizing there's a lot at stake here. Democracy itself, as we keep saying. But I've been taught this whole time how to engage politics in a certain way. And now you've got these two candidates, one standing for what would become authoritarianism, and one standing for, at the very least, the preservation of democracy. And I have to decide. And I don't know how to do that because I've never had to deeply think about it in these terms before. So that I think there's a political crisis of identity going on with some, and they're honestly playing catch up, because this whole time I'm like, well, what about all of the Christians throughout our history as a nation who have not voted for the conservative party, whatever label it used? And what do you do with that? So we're still dealing with all of this. And if you look at the conversation online around the DNC, it's as if you're not on the right and you're not voting Republican, you cannot talk about God. And that's the impression that people seem to be giving and getting.
Well, I'm going to jump in and talk about some numbers in a minute, but before I do that, I want to kind of stay on this the DNC RNC thread and kind of pull in the contrast between the two. And I'd love to hear, maybe go back to you, Kristin, too, since you were like in the room. What have we all seen in terms of how religion played? What work does kind of calls to religious faith, religious identity? What work did that do at the Republican National Convention, and what work is that doing at the Democratic National Convention? Because I think they're quite different.
Very perceptive of you, Robby. Yes, and I have to go back, it seems like ages ago now, to the RNC, and I didn't watch all of the talks there. I watched a sampling, whereas I think I've caught nearly all of the talks at the DNC. But there, religion really functions in an exclusivist way. And Christianity as also exclusivist, and not just Christians versus others, but really only a particular type of Christianity is meant there. And that is a Christianity that is very tightly wrapped up with right-wing politics, one that essentially upholds authoritarian rule and MAGA politics. And so it's religion in the service of power, really. And it really feels weaponized. Now, we can talk about how religion functions in the Democratic Party, and there's I think a lot more diversity there, not just in the religious traditions, that's obvious, but also kind of how people understand the connection between faith and politics. It's not this kind of monolithic or coercive tool. It is, again, more kind of bringing your private or personal convictions and then bringing that into the political marketplace of ideas. And not not this kind of weaponized faith. That said, I think a really interesting conversation kind of formed around Evangelicals for Harris when that was announced. Of course, you were getting hit from the right, and that was very predictable because it's a danger to them and their understanding of religion, or the way they're weaponizing religion, which is, if you're a Christian, you're with us. And then if you're not, you're against us. And Evangelicals for Harris absolutely blows that up. And that's why the group has to be attacked, right? So that's part of what's at play. But then there were real questions of, well, is the Evangelicals for Harris just the same thing on the other side? And I listened to the call. Like I listened to the whole call, and I was actually really impressed by the nuance that each and every participant on that call brought to it. Saying, no, it's not. And they were actually critiquing. Some Evangelicals for Harris were critiquing the Democratic Party on abortion. Some were critiquing the Democratic Party on LGBTQ and still standing up for Harris. So there was this more distance and saying, yes, I am, but I'm also using that position to critique the party. And not saying that if you are evangelical or if you are Christian, you therefore must support this political party. That's a huge difference. And that your salvation is at stake, and you are not a true Christian, and you are going to be damned to hell, right? If you are not supporting that, like none of that kind of rhetoric. So that entire tone was different, and also how it is being used. I have to say, I came across some really interesting coverage of Evangelicals for Harris and faith at the DNC today on CBN, of all places, Christian Broadcasting Network, right? And it was a piece by David Brody. And if you know who that is, he wrote a book on Donald Trump's faith, which I had the privilege of reviewing. You can look it up, it's a fun one. And Gordon Robertson was in this piece, Pat Robertson's son, right? So this is who we're talking about, not what you would think. I actually retweeted it put it out on social media, a very nuanced and lengthy piece on Evangelicals for Harris. And the conclusion was essentially, first of all, it was a very nuanced presentation. And then the conclusion was actually, from Robertson himself, this is a good thing to his conservative Christians. We need we need Christians in the Democratic Party. It's good for the country. It's good for the Democratic Party. And it just was shocking to me to read this from a conservative Christian standpoint, or to hear it from a conservative Christian place, which is not how things have been played. It's this polarizing, if you are a Christian, you will not be in the Democratic Party, has been the party line for decades now. This flipped this, saying we need Christians in all the parties. And just that completely changes the conversation.
Can I just jump in? I can't help it here. Whenever I hear like Brody or other folks on the right talking about Christians, they always mean white people. Because there's been plenty of Christians in the Democratic Party. There's just not so many
Completely.
white Christians,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. Right.
So like
That's why I don't know how many, air quotes to put around this, but this was a notable change in their rhetoric.
No, I take your point.
Hindsight.
And at the same time, I keep thinking like, we need Christians that what are you talking about? Like
this is exactly what I said to who was it? Laura Loomer.
Yes.
She's got like 1.2 million followers on X/Twitter. And I think she went person by person, whoever was listed as speaking on the Evangelicals for Harris call, she did this extended social media post to sort of smear us. And I said on her thread, I posted it on mine, and I said on her thread, but what about the Black church? Essentially, what do you do with all the Black Christians who had been voting Democratic since at least the 1960s? No response. I couldn't believe it. She didn't respond. I was shocked.
Yeah. No, I'm just going to throw in some numbers here because it seems like a good place to do it. Like one of my favorite charts to kind of pull out is just like whenever you hear the Godless Democratic Party or those Godless liberals and GOP as God's own party, stuff, like to look at the religious affiliation of the two political parties, kind of not just like the parties, but Americans who self-identify as Republican or self-identify as Democrat. And you look at the Democratic Party, it's 70% religious, 70%, right? Identify as religion, most of them identifying as some kind of Christian. Now, where the numbers are really different is that like for Republicans, nearly a third of the Republican Party is just one group, white evangelical Protestants, and that group only makes up 4% of Democrats. But it's remarkable, right? That it's 70% of the Democratic Party that's religiously. They're people of faith, and all kinds of different faiths, but they're still people of faith. Most of them also are Christian, and it just I still am in disbelief that they can that folks on the right, the Christian right, can still throw around the word Christian as if it only means white evangelical Protestants and get away with it. Like, and that they say it in such a way. I don't even think it's strategic. I think it actually is the way their world is mapped
Yeah.
in their head. Right? It's not like they're being trying to throw something out to be shifty or something. It's just literally the way they think about the world.
Can I say something that will sound controversial or provocative, but it's just history. A lot of this dialogue about who's Christian, who's not, it reminds me of the theologizing being done during the Civil War, during between Northern and Southern theologians and Christians, by which I mean Southerners who were conservative, if you want to use that language, would look at chapter and verse of the Bible and say, nowhere in the Bible does it condemn slavery. It regulates it, but it doesn't abolish it or say we need to get rid of it. Anti-slavery theologians were saying the opposite. Well, it may not say in explicit terms, don't enslave people, although it does talk about man stealing in the Old Testament. There's this little thing that Jesus said about loving God and loving your neighbor. And so how is it loving? But the rebuttal was, well, they're not using the Bible, or they're twisting the Bible, or they're liberal about it and not really taking it as authoritative or literal or whatever language you want to use. And so obviously it's not a one-to-one correlation here, but what I'm trying to say is this boundary markers of who's Christian and who's not, and how like you said before, Kristin, about an exclusivist kind of Christianity or God talk, really, that narrows who can be part of this according to a very strict set of fundamentals, if you will, that you have to check all those boxes. And then, we have examples. Raphael Warnock was extremely eloquent in the DNC talk, and he says, talking about a vote is a kind of prayer, and of course bringing in the Black homiletical tradition, of course occupying the same pulpit that Martin Luther King Jr. did, and he's an elected official, which is nothing foreign or strange to the Black Christian tradition. And so I talked on the Evangelicals for Harris call about a thin political theology versus a thick political theology, and I posted it on my Substack. I won't go all into it here, but it's just like, again, and y'all feel free to disagree with me, I just think like this is a moment where a lot of white evangelicals are finally getting exposure to a different expression of faith in politics. And a lot of them are confused because they haven't really been, even from 2016, maybe 2020, but it's just interesting to watch. It's interesting to watch.
I would say the other thing that I think is confusing them is that Trump has finally ripped the lid off of the abortion myth right here, and has scrambled the playing board a bit here, because he's not playing that game in the same way that other Republican candidates do. I mean, let's be clear, that was a myth anyway, right? All the data shows that the real propellant for white evangelicals moving, like my grandparents in Georgia, were all Democrats. By the time I got to my little Baptist college in the sort of late 1980s, there was not even an operating student Democratic group. There was a vibrant college Republican group. There was defunct. Like there literally was nothing you could join at Mississippi College in the late 1980s there. And so that sea change was not about abortion. It was not about gay marriage, right? That sea change, all the data suggests and shows that was a great white flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party over the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. That was the propellant that moved them from one party to the next. And I think what's hard is that they were able to tell themselves that's not the reason why we're Republican. we're Republican because of abortion. We're Republican because we stand for traditional, heterosexual marriage, whatever. But they can't quite tell themselves that, and then they're having to face the racist stuff. I think for the first time, because Trump is running this explicitly nativist, racist campaign, anti-Semitic campaign, right? And so I think they're having to face, I think, the kind of uglier realities, I think, of why evangelicals have been so bound to the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think to jump on that, the issue of abortion is kind of mixing things up right now in interesting ways. The fact that Trump now, you just can't make the case that he's pro-life, or that his position, even in the position of the Republican Party at this point, is
Yeah.
a pro-life party. And I would hope that could lead to some introspection then within the pro-life movement. And I think there's some you're talking about the deeper history there, Robby, of going back to the 60s and the 70s and the party realignment. But then we have generations now of evangelicals that have been born into and kind of brought up in this pro-life politics, right? I mean, I certainly was raised in that, and it's a difficult moment for many of those Christians, I think, who had been told and who firmly believe, right, that life begins at conception and that abortion is murder. Even then, when you look at some of the polling numbers, right, this doesn't mean that they're all abolitionists or that there are no exceptions. And what we have right now is this real moment where there's just enormous pressure coming from the right inside pro-life spaces post Dobbs of now, okay, we got that far now, abolitionism, no exceptions for rape or incest or health of the mother. We're going after it all, right? And just brutally punishing these, what we called in-group moderates who are not all that moderate, but still not complete abolitionists, right? So pressure is coming from the right there, but also a real discomfort for these folks, if they're looking over to the Democratic Party, where they maybe could have found a home even 6, 7, 10, certainly 10 years ago with a safe, legal, and rare, right? And the Democratic Party has, for some strategic reasons, abandoned that framing and gone in the direction of destigmatizing and now leaning all in, which makes a lot of sense if you're looking at polling data right now, and if you look at the last midterms, right? And so you have this whole group of pro-life voters right now who are looking for a home, and they're not finding it in the Trump spaces. They're not sure if they are welcome in the Democratic spaces, and I don't have a lot of kind of thoughts on that, except just observing that that's where things stand. And I think there's a kind of reckoning that needs to happen within the pro-life movement of what happens when, for decades now, you've tied your pro-life politics and convictions together with, let's be honest, racism, patriarchy, misogyny, just outright misogyny. And for a long time, when I would kind of hear those talking points from the left, I'd try to, well, I want to complicate this, right? I want to know these are some genuine convictions, and they are genuine convictions about life and when it begins. But they have been so conflated with anti-woman, patriarchal, right, coercive authority structures inside the Republican Party and inside right-wing Christianity that I have a really hard time making that case anymore. Right. So I think that there is a reckoning that has to happen within the pro-life movement itself, and kind of just rethink the whole narrative and the way the game is being played. And again, maybe look at some of those that data that we have about what actually reduces abortion in this country, what sorts of policies, what sorts of politics do. And if you really want to present a compelling case against abortion, how might you do that in a way that has not been effectively done for several decades now because they've been pursuing another agenda?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, just as a reminder too, that on this point of complete and wholesale bans of abortion, there are only single digits of Americans who support that extreme position. And even if you look at the most conservative states, Louisiana, for example, a heavily Catholic state, it's far less than 20%. that support, even in the most conservative states who support. You can't even get 1 in 5 members of the most conservative states to support a complete ban on abortion. So I think that reckoning, is I think coming to roost as well.
One of my favorite things to do as a historian in this conversation around abortion is to go back to the 1960s and 1970s and up until the late 70s. Right, there was a wide range of views about abortion within the evangelical community, and anybody who's followed Randy Ballmer's work and knows, right, I think you were alluding to the importance here of segregationism in terms of political mobilization, and only in the late 70s was abortion kind of substituted for that. Um, that said, there is a much longer tradition of opposition to abortion within Christianity more generally, and you can certainly find it within evangelicalism.
1979 that the Southern Baptist Convention finally got around
Yeah,
to.
right.
Yeah.
Through the early 70s, mid 70s, SBC was pro-choice, right?
Yep.
We have to know that history, but also I love to go back to this 1968 special edition of Christianity Today, a whole magazine, a whole issue on contraception and abortion. Read it; it is fascinating. And one of the key pieces there is a theological analysis of ensoulment. Of ensoulment. When does the soul enter the body? And how do we understand that? And how do we reconcile this theological question or apply this theological question to what we now know in terms of modern science? I mean, what a fascinating theological question, and a question that I have not heard asked for at least a generation now, if not more. Right. So the theology around this question has almost not been allowed. And I think that we have an impoverished theological discourse now around this absolutely critical question. And so I would love to be able to go and draw some of those resources from 50, 60 years ago and put them on the table again. And how do we have these conversations around life and around how we approach this in a pluralist society, and how Christians bring their religious views to the table on an issue where people are bringing very different religious and moral understandings of these issues, and what has been lost perhaps in pursuing this hardcore political game and abandoning other modes of discourse and of persuasion.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons why, I mean, there's some kind of very practical reasons why Democrats have had to have that kind of conversation. And it's just because of the diversity of the party compared to the amount of monolith that the Republican Party has become. I mean, the Republican Party today is essentially a white Christian party. It's 70% white and Christian, right? In a country that's 40% white and Christian, and the Democratic Party is 25% white and Christian. So we've got this kind of real kind of disconnect between the two parties. And one of the things it means, though, is that there's also a generational fight playing out along these lines as well. We have talked a lot about age, but if you look at if you kind of map the kind of racial and religious diversity of this is one of my favorite charts. I'm going to try to describe it. But if you map the kind of racial and religious diversity of self-identified Democrats and self-identified Republicans on top of generational cohorts, what you see is that the religious and racial composition of the Democratic Party looks about like 18-year-old America. And the racial and religious composition of the Republican Party looks like, wait for it, 70-year-old America, right? So it's really, really striking. And so part of the reason why we hear things like "Make America Great Again," right, is that you're appealing to this kind of 70-year-old America, and you're hearing things like, "We're not going back, we're going forward," right, from the Harris and Walz campaign, because they're appealing to this kind of 18-year-old, right? America doesn't want to go back. Doesn't even remember the America that they're talking about, reclaiming, and certainly doesn't want to go back and live in it.
Kristin, did you get a sense of youth at the DNC? I bring it up because I read an article that was criticizing bringing back the favorites, or at least, the familiar people from Clinton and others, and saying, yeah, it's kind of feel good for people who've been voting for a while, but is it getting out is it motivating younger voters to actually take action? What was your sense being at the DNC?
I mean, I think you always bring out the old guard. I mean, at least when you can, the RNC couldn't really do that because there are very few, there are no former Republican presidents who endorse Trump, and no great Republican leaders really. I think that they could bring together, which doesn't mean they went for the youth, mind you, like, so comparatively, I think that's just what you do at conventions, right? You're kind of tying it to this, to the past, certainly. But I actually, among attendees, delegates, I mean, I don't know. I'm not young anymore either, so I don't know. It felt kind of young to me. Yeah, it felt very young. Yeah, there are a lot of 20 somethings there, attending and working there. I spent some quality time in line with other, a couple hours. It's funny. I was listening to NBC's coverage as I was driving home last night, and they kept kind of looking behind them at they're in this press booth and saying, "Oh, there's still some empty seats here," and they're like, "Well, I guess you don't have to come early to this rally." And I thought, how do you guys not know? This is like night 3, and people were thousands of people are lined up like right outside of your building there. Trust me, I was in that group and we couldn't get in. They had like a narrow security gate, and it was extremely high security. So, thousands of us got in a couple hours later than when we'd wanted to. So anyway, just like if you're hearing that kind of coverage, like, still some empty seats, don't buy it. There's thousands of people who weren't able to get in each night too. Young people, extremely diverse, in every possible way, and just extremely positive crowds. I also think that we really saw a new generation of leadership platformed as well. So we could say, yeah, the Obamas were there and Clintons were there and so on, as they ought to be. But Pete Buttigieg just absolutely brought down the House. You've got AOC there, you've got Wes Moore, you've got just a number
Asman Crockett, yeah.
yeah, it really did feel like a well balanced, kind of passing of the torch, rooted in this longer tradition. But the future looks pretty bright, I think, for the Democratic Party if they can hold this together. And one more thing I'll say about kind of the whole spirit of the event is that those dark days from the summer, dark days from the last several years, to be honest, right? I think that those have not been wasted, right? That the urgency that many of us felt, the anxiety, the pressures that we felt, and we are not out of the woods yet, not out of the woods, right? But the momentum has shifted. But still, that sense of hopelessness, even, right, has changed. I think many Democrats, where they are more willing to be more unified, more willing to, I mean, Michelle Obama's address spoke directly, I think, to the tendency among Democrats to eat their own, to, this cancel culture. As soon as anybody makes one misstep, to jump on them and just to pull apart. And the overwhelming spirit here was positivity, welcoming in the Republicans for Harris, welcoming in the evangelicals for Harris. Sure, we've got differences, but we need to pull together. I think probably the outstanding difference, if you want to call it that, that has not been smoothed over and is an outstanding question is the question of Gaza, and whether or not we're going to see a pro-Palestinian speaker on the main stage, and how they're going to be handling that. In the line, I caught in the distance some of the protesters. It wasn't kind of where I was. I didn't get more than a glimpse of it, but I know there's been some coverage there. A couple months ago, it was expected that this would be a major disruption at the convention. I'm curious to see if they're going to address that at all on this final night, and how so. But I think that is the one kind of significant division that the Democratic Party still has to deal with. But apart from that, it just was an overwhelming sense of we've got bigger issues here, and this particular historical moment requires unity and acknowledging differences, but we have a common goal.
Well, we're getting close to the end. Jemar, I'm going to throw it over to you for any last remarks, and then we'll say goodnight.
I'll highlight that how Kamala Harris and Tim Walz deal with Gaza, deal with ending that conflict, deal with helping to establish peace and justice there. That's going to be a big deal. And it's also, in my view, the wild card, because the U.S. doesn't control that completely. We control our part in it, but there's a lot that could happen that could shift and sway public and global opinion on that. So that's something to watch for, and I do hope that that it's dealt with pretty seriously and not simply politically by the campaign. We still have work to do. That's the last word.
All right. Thanks, Mara. Thanks, Kristin. All right. On that note, it's time we bring this episode of the Convocation Unscripted to a close. On behalf of the three of us here, Kristin Du Mez, Jemar Tisby, and myself, Robby Jones, and our other partner, Diana Butler-Bass, who is out on vacation this week, we'd like to thank you for tuning in and encouraging you to subscribe to the Convocation Substack, as well as our social media channels, which can be found in the show notes for the episode. The Convocation Unscripted is a collaborative effort between Robert P. Jones, Diana Butler-Bass, Kristin Du Mez, and Jemar Tisby, and powered by the Public Religion Research Institute. Our producer for the show is Bo York, with production services provided by Podastery. Thanks again for listening. And with that said, we are officially adjourned. See you next time.